Welcome to Sexually Charged Radio. I am one of your co-hosts, Ruthie, and I am here with...
Thomas!
Yay, Thomas is here, and we are talking about sex, gender, relationships, sexuality, all kinds of good stuff like that here on 93.3 FM, CFRU.ca, and today's topic is...
Our topic is going to be about mixed class relationships.
And why is this an important topic?
Well, for lots of reasons. First and foremost, relationships are seldom similar, seldom uniform. Partners that we may wish to have are going to be very different from us. Mm-hmm. We live in a world of so much diversity and so much awesomeness that, that old adage of birds of a feather fly together isn't necessarily holding true. Opposites attract.
Yeah. Well, not across all. Well, now, as a researcher, actually, most relationships do have certain core values in common, but just because those core values in common are there doesn't mean that the class is going to be at the same level. But it's also an unspoken thing. Mm-hmm. And so I was at a workshop at this fantastic conference in mid-October called Sex Down South. It takes place in Atlanta. It was the second year. Everybody should look it up and go to sexdownsouth.com and sign up for the 2017 when they start doing registration for that. It was a fantastic event. And I caught a part of a workshop called Beyond Who Gets the Check, Navigating Mixed Class Relationships. It was taught by Lyndon Cudlitz. Hopefully I said that correctly. If not, I apologize. And the description is, if you've ever dated or been in a relationship with someone from a different socioeconomic class background, you may have felt as though you're operating in different languages. And you're right. This interactive workshop examines the vital role class holds in our relationships and how it interplays with dynamics of queerness, race, immigration, gender, non-monogamy, ability, age, and more. We'll explore our challenges and hopes and leave the tools we can use for better communication and action to support the health of our mixed class relationships. And I just want to read that list of intersectionality again, which is not comprehensive, but is a great starting place. Queerness, race, immigration, gender, non-monogamy, ability, age, and more. And how all of these things play into class and overlap with things like finances.
Absolutely. I love that list because it really got me thinking about how different relationships might look, mm-hmm. and what those relationships may mean to different people. And I am just so tickled to be able to have this as our topic.
Yeah, it's so, it's really important. And getting in there, I was thinking about intersectionality and stuff like that, but to have it be this broader conversation, but also as a large room full of lots of people with lots of different demographics and intersectionality going on, and to have that conversation with so many people of diverse social locations is really interesting. Although, granted, a lot of people in the room had paid to be at the conference, and there was a lot of acknowledging that there was likely some level of financial privilege for many of the people in the room, although certainly not all.
Yeah, and I think, we're a campus radio station, and for me, as a graduate student, but also as an undergraduate student, I've really thought a lot about money. Mm-hmm. And relationships.
Truth.
And I'm sure when I stop being a student, I will still think a lot about money and relationships.
But you'll think about it differently.
Very differently. And, thinking about if I'm going on a date with someone, who's going to take the check? Mm-hmm. If I think about where that date's going to be, what kind of, if we're going to a movie, do we each pay our own way? Does one person pay? Does the other person not? Do we balance, this time I get the meal, next time you get the meal? Even just traveling to places. I don't have a car. Mm-hmm. So, I take public transit or taxis or Ubers.
And that's not just financial expense. That's time expense and resources, and also other types of labor to coordinate that and figure out how that will work. And a certain level of vulnerability, where it might be a little harder to leave the space if you want to. So there's added risk as well.
And having to communicate that to a partner and say, I don't have a car. So if that person does, it's like, so are you able to drive, or do I find my own way to get there?
Do you feel safe being in someone else's car? Those considerations as well.
Yeah, that mixed class or mixed socioeconomic status considerations. As a student, I have really, noticed a lot more. Mm-hmm. And it also has kind of prevented me from looking for relationships too, because I think, well, I don't have a vehicle, and then I feel really like, oh, am I worth dating if I can't travel around easily?
Well, and I'm thinking about housing situations too. So if you want to bring someone back to your place, whether it's just for Netflix or for Netflix and chill, thinking about how that works with living situations and the privilege of having privacy, or living with people who are fine with you taking over the living room or whatever, or even having your own bedroom is sometimes not going to work out. Parking space, if that's an issue, childcare, and having that work out and feeling like you can be dating at that point too. Or more intense relationships, how do you divide up the rent when different kinds of labor are happening in the relationship and not all of them are paid labor?
Absolutely. And then you think about, live-in situations of, well, who's taking care of the food and who takes care of cooking. And if I still have my place and you have your place, but we're spending most of the time at your place, at what point do we talk about, contributions? And how does that conversation even start? So I think we've got so much to talk about here. So much.
So there was one particular example that was really striking for me, and thinking about taking this to a further level, because some of it is like, how do you split the money? But if you're not talking about deeper intersectionality of it, you can say, it's easy for me to say as a salaried person that I'll pick up the tab, which I do in non-dating social situations frequently, if I am making the assumption that I probably have more financial stability than the other people that I'm there with.
You've done that with me. I'm very appreciative of that.
But that to me is fairness, right? It's an abundance of culture, but it's also, I think, from my background of having lived on, federal assistance, food stamps for a while, and having done those things, and I don't think less of that past self of mine. I just recognize that resource distribution is not a fair thing. It's not a fair thing, and sometimes financial distribution and the distribution of those resources happens in less official ways, by some people picking up the tab more than others, or friends who have an Amazon wish list and really need some things, and that they need it, and you have a little disposable income. That's a different way, kind of an unofficial way of distribution of financial resources that I think is important. But I probably wouldn't think about that as much if I hadn't spent periods of time with, negative financial resources, frankly. But to me, that's a social justice effort that's really important. But it's also really important that it as often as possible, it go unnoticed. Which is fine that you mentioned it, and I appreciate it, and thank you for your appreciation. But it to me is also very important that it not be a thing that's done for appreciation, but be seen as a political activity of redistribution of financial resources. So there's talk about, we make it a spreadsheet, and so we pay the rent 60-40% and stuff, which was great. And then we got to some really real heartstrings type stuff. So there was one person in the group who, shared a story of a time in a relationship where both people were pursuing things that were medical gender transition things, and that's very expensive. Whether people are doing hormones or surgery or hair removal or whatever direction it is that you're going in, these things cost a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of emotional labor and things like that. And if both the people in the relationship are needing and wanting that, but there's not that many relationships out there that could financially sustain one person doing that, much less two, or however many people are in that relationship. Then how do you make those decisions? And if one person has insurance coverage for some of that, does that mean that they get to just go ahead and go full force forward, or should they be withholding some of their financial resources to redistribute to the other person who doesn't have that insurance, thereby slowing down their own progress with this that they really need, that can be very life-saving, in order for the other person to be more on the same timeline?
Yeah.
So this suddenly was like, whoa, you bring in the gender and the queerness to it, and this got real really fast.
Yeah. So maybe, for our listeners, I was going to say our readers, our listeners, we can break it down just into that first initial conversation. How do you start talking about where you are financially and where the other person is financially? Because money is hard to talk about.
It is.
It's uncomfortable.
So as a person who has pretty decent financial privilege, and I've certainly dated people who have much more money than I have, but I am defining decent financial privilege as I am not worried that a small or medium emergency will wipe me out. And at the end of a typical month, I have money left over. So I may have actually been using that money during the month. It's not really financially there, but it's left over for luxury things, which I may have used during the course of the month. And if I didn't at the end of the month, there would be that money left over, right? So on average, it would be there. And so to me, that's a lot of financial privilege, and is a lot more than I've had at many periods of my adult life and some periods of my child life too. So as a person packing that privilege, and also white skin privilege and academic privilege and lots of other privileges at the same time, I feel like it's my responsibility to initiate that conversation, but it's a very delicate, difficult one because I don't want to offend anyone. So sometimes that will come up for me. Well, one of the things I think about is if I'm inviting people to go have a meal with me and I know they have less finances than I do, I'm making that invitation with my own internal knowledge that, especially if I'm picking the place that we go to, that I should be willing to pay for some or all of it because I have initiated a thing that costs money. And I've asked another person with less money to join me in this thing that costs money.
Yeah, and I love that sort of awareness that if I'm choosing an activity, then I take some onus of responsibility for making this an activity that everyone can enjoy.
Yeah.
Because
it's about accessibility.
Yeah, and not everyone can do everything or would necessarily want to do everything as a high priority, but they want to spend time with you. So, if they feel obligated, this is how they can have time to spend time with you, and then they feel like they need to pay money for that. It's nice to just know, okay, I'm asking for this, I'm going to expect to pay. And maybe that person will make a decision that no, they want to pay for themselves or pay for part of it, and that's their decision to make. And you should never railroad and dismiss whatever their choice is. But at least you go in trying to be more equitable and try to be a bit fairer around matters.
One thing I'm not as good at, but I wish I were better at, is proposing at least two options. One that has a cost that I'm willing to cover some or all of, and I make that clear in a respectful manner, hopefully. And the other one being an activity that's low or no cost, because also it shouldn't feel like someone is forced into the receiving side of a sugar daddy relationship. If they're not interested in that, if that feels weird to them, or it shouldn't feel like that kind of relationship at all, right? So one thing I've learned about people with money from being on both sides of it is that people with money often choose activities that cost money. And so I'm not as likely to think of going for a walk in the park or going to free music at the library or wherever it may be in your neighborhood as I am to think of going to a movie or going to something with a cover charge or a ticket price attached to it.
Yeah, and I think it's becoming more aware and calling upon yourself that, okay, what activities do I like? What activities have I chosen in the past? And that can help you recognize some of that privilege in yourself if it's not already evident. Sure.
And it can be letting the other person pick the activity too. Like if you're not that good at finding things that cost money or don't cost money, inviting the other person to pick the thing or taking turns back and forth and paying a lot of attention to what they tend to pick can be helpful. So sometimes I'll say things like, I've really had a taste for this place. I'm happy to get all of it or part of it, and then just continue the conversation. I don't necessarily wait for the other person to tell me whether they're going to take me up on it. That maybe gets renegotiated at the point where the bill comes. If I haven't mentioned it ahead of time, I try really hard to mention it at the point where everyone's looking at the menu, because I'm well aware from past experience that somebody might be looking at the menu for the most affordable thing they can get that doesn't look like they're trying to pick the cheapest thing. And I would hate for someone to be in that uncomfortable position when it's not necessary. Although if they want to make that decision, then it's their choice and not because I forced that upon them.
Yeah, and I think, we all, either in the movies, television, or in real life, have had that battle over the check.
Yeah.
Where,
there's a lot of power in who pays for it.
Absolutely. And it's always that awkward moment when the wait staff comes and says, one check or two, or, split or together. And you're just kind of like, ugh, what do I say? Like, I want to look like I'm a generous person, so if I say together, but then, that's not necessarily feasible all the time for me.
Sure.
Or, if I say together, then does the other person think that I'm expecting them to pay for it together?
But I think you made a good point with the word generous. And I'm not being generous. I'm trying to be fair. And my privilege is undue privilege in a lot of ways. Yes, I worked hard to get my academic degree and to get this job. Other people worked hard too, and they didn't get this. Maybe they didn't want this. That's fine. But their income being lower than mine is not because they work less hard. They probably work more hard than I do. I'm here making a radio show in my office, for God's sake, you know.
And a radio show called Sexually Charged at 93.3 FM in the Guelph area and online at cfru.ca. And how else can they listen to us, Ruthie?
On YouTube for free by Googling Sexually Charged. And you can also stream us on cfru.ca, as we mention frequently. And you can send your questions to AskSC at UOGuelph, GUELPH.ca, where our wonderful unpaid student interns at Student Wellness will field your questions and send some of them our way.
To clarify, they're volunteers.
They are volunteered, yes.
We don't do unpaid internships in Ontario.
Oh, really? Oh, is that a thing? Okay. So they are strictly volunteers, which makes sense. And it's a whole host of great people who put in their time. So,
yeah, you can get course credit for an internship and then be unpaid.
Oh.
But
Thank you for clarifying that for me. I'll be sure to watch my language. And also to better educate myself on the difference between volunteers and interns. I'm not in charge of them, so I don't know. But thank you for telling me.
So we're talking about mixed class relationships.
So it's not a generosity thing. It's recognizing privilege and undue privilege, and it's not that I didn't work hard to earn it, because I did, but that doesn't mean that they didn't work hard to earn what they have, which may not be the same amount that I have, or my amount may not be the same amount that someone else has, and that doesn't mean that they work harder than I do. So I think that's a key point, but there's so much to unpack underneath that, and even to bring it up can be offensive, and I'm aware of that. And there's a certain amount of risk involved in it, and I don't think I'm always real great at it, but I'm trying to learn how to do it better each time. And there's other things. Let's talk about some of these other intersectionality things, because I think this is important too. So when we're looking at this, so queerness. So we know that there's a lot of finance around queerness, both in the expenses and in the reduced likelihood of disposable income. So there is a stereotype that especially gay men in relationships will have all kinds of disposable income because of this idea that there's no children, or that gay men all look amazing and therefore must have a lot of money or something like that. And our statistics, at least the ones I've seen for North America, very clearly state that any kind of sexual or gender minority status means increased risk of lower income.
Yeah, it's a really interesting statistic, and I think this is one of the areas where intersectionality is so evident, in that when we look at sexual minorities who also are racialized or ethnic minorities as well, that we do see this pay gap increase, where white gay men do make less than heterosexual white men. There is sort of a distinction even within that category of individuals who are white gay men and highly educated who are making a significant amount more than their compatriots, their
other cohort
comparable
members?
groups.
Yeah, right, people who share some of those demographics.
So it really is, you have to look at multiple identities and that intersection to understand some of the complexity of how queerness and finances do play into each other. And I think, we've talked about in previous shows about queerness among youth and either getting kicked out of the home or lack of financial support by family members. All of that, how can change experiences from a young age that then change experiences later in life because you haven't had the same opportunities going forward.
Well, and there's also looking across a lifespan and the consideration that if some of the events that have happened in your life have delayed your career path in some way, because you had to start over, because you had to stop for medical reasons, because there were mental health concerns that you had to resolve before you could move forward, or an ongoing thing to resolve, that delay of a few years or that restart or that slowing of that progress has huge lifetime effects as well. And these are all things to consider. I mean, we see that with people who stop work in order to have a baby, right? So in any other sort of situation, or in situations where you're dealing with a lot of oppression during important developmental times in your childhood and your young adulthood, and you're gonna need some time to work through that later and to kind of catch up and be on your feet and things, and that's not your fault. That is a more challenging life path to be on, and that's real, and that can change your priorities and also how other people are responding to you. Really, it's not your priorities because of you, it's because of the other people's problems with you. So, and then if we add ethnicity into that too, so one of the things that always just chaps my butt is when people are talking about how women make 70 some cents on the dollar compared to men, and they don't even mention in there that that's the white woman statistic. You know, it's down into 60 some cents and probably lower depending on, you know, if you are of African descent, if you are Hispanic or Latina, right? And so even in our trying to promote these statistics, we mess it up on the intersectionality around the awareness. So that adds a tremendous amount in this too. And although we talk a lot about queerness in the show, that really is a reflection of our skin privilege, that we're thinking of that first because we have the privilege of not thinking about skin stuff so much.
There's actually a really great video that's been twirling around.
Yeah, like us, we twirl around. Yeah,
and it's called Pink Sourcing, and Kristen Bell, the actress, is doing sort of a parody of, you know, if organizations want to make more money, they need to hire more women because they can pay them less and give them less opportunities.
I saw that, yeah.
And, you know, it is a parody and it's satire, but the details that are covered in there, and it does talk more intersectionally about particularly women of color and the amounts that they're paid in proportion to white women. And, you know, we need to talk more about that. We need to acknowledge the fact that, you know, this is happening at all levels, you know, at the CEO level, but it's all the way, to you know, what individuals are paid when they work at a fast food chain, that we see these differences emerge. So in terms of socioeconomic position, you know, and in dating relationships or in friendship relationships, whatever they might be, you know, those distinctions of financial accessibility are evident and are there.
Yeah, and it's complicated when you're in a relationship where there is enough money to get by to think about how do we consider this our money and not my money and your money, and some sort of redistribution of financial resources if everybody wants to be doing that, of course. But it gets even harder when there's not enough money for everything, and everybody has to really advocate for their needs, or it's not going to happen. Then dealing with that becomes all the more complicated, right? And these become really big questions. And if we're dealing with things around non-monogamy, then, you know, there can be questions of how many incomes do we need to support everyone? What kind of obligations do people have to take jobs that's maybe not physically or emotionally good for them in order to support this larger family group? And same if there's children involved, right? You know, how do we divide up support? How do we make that happen?
Or if you're doing elder care, you know, within a dynamic, you know, parents often, you know, in certain circumstances, want to take care of their kids, but if they get to a certain age where they don't have the financial resources, and suddenly it's up to your financial resources to figure out how to, you know, support them, and having those conversations and understandings that maybe their entire life they've tried to support you, but now it's turning around the other direction for certain dynamics.
Is it okay to pay a lower portion of the rent because you're now paying part of your parents' rent? And what does that mean for the other people in your relationship? Even just being open to having these conversations and trying to recognize the social justice element of it, to take it out of this very individualistic, like, I failed or I deserve or whatever the case may be, and instead try to be looking at it from a sense of collaborativeness. That in itself is an act of political resistance, right? And it doesn't mean that it's going to work out okay, right? Like it might not work out okay, either for the relationship and its longevity, or just for the fact that there's just not enough resources to go around. But these become big things that need to be discussed, because the person with the class status that's less privileged, will be on a personal level paying for things all the time if it's not discussed. And financially, the things that they pay for cost more, and emotionally, they cost more. And that conversation may be difficult to have initially, and it may be asking each other's consent for a very risky conversation and trying to learn from each other how to do it better. But to recognize that it needs to happen, and I think and from my opinion as a person who comes in with a lot of privileges, but has some awareness of not having privileges because of other demographics that I have or have had, is the person with more privileges' responsibility to try to do the right thing and at least create a safe space for that conversation, but not force the other person into it.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about all these things. We're not perfect. And, I mean, Ruthie's pretty close.
I'm working on it.
But it's something that I've struggled a lot with over the years. That's why, when this topic came up, I was really excited about it. Because I've been in relationships in the past where, for me, my economic position, I am much better off than many people in this world, and I am very grateful, and I strive to recognize that privilege. But where I've been in relationships with folks where they haven't recognized sort of that imbalance in our privileges. And so then, it was always really hard for me to try to raise that topic. I felt a lot of shame about it.
Sure.
And, so then I ended up paying more than I could and doing more than was reasonable for me, or maybe not reasonable, that's maybe a bad word, but more than was financially within my means.
Right.
And that took a huge toll on me. I was emotionally upset, both angry and sad that this other person wasn't aware of this. It was financially difficult because, I paid for this dinner that was far outside of my means, and now that meant I needed to not do this, that, or this in my life.
But that's what it took to spend time with him, to feel the power balance that you needed to feel, to not feel a sense of shame, all these other sorts of things. Like it wasn't a frivolous act to go have this dinner. It was important. It was important in a lot of ways.
And all of these tensions, ate away at me and ate away at the relationship. And I would say that's why a number of my relationships in my past have not been successful, both romantic, friendship, and onwards, because when others didn't recognize what was happening, it just became too much, and I couldn't address it. I didn't feel like I could. Now, after having this conversation, I feel like I have some tools from Sexually Charged Radio to do that in the future. But, relationships can really suffer as a result of this. So, it is real, and we're not perfect. It's happened to us. So for those of you out there who are experiencing it yourself, you're not alone.
And for those of you who feel like you're not experiencing it, it's up to you to start sacrificing some privilege. Step on up, my friends. So from us at Sexually Charged Radio to Lyndon Cudlitz and Sex Down South Conference for this great workshop around Beyond Who Gets the Check, Navigating Mixed Class Relationships, our appreciation for inspiring this conversation here on Sexually Charged Radio. And I am looking forward to our next episode and spending more time with you, Thomas, and with you, listeners, at 93.3 FM CFRU.
Thank you so much, Ruthie, and thank you again to all of you listeners.
Thank you.